I woke up that morning feeling perfectly fine, or at least perfectly aware that I wasn't. My body was healthy, my mind clear, but my plan was already in motion. I slid out of bed quietly, careful not to wake my wife, and let the thought linger. Let's see who actually notices. Breakfast was my first test. I sat at the kitchen table, feigning weakness, my head bowed, pretending my arms barely held the fork. The smell of her coffee hit my nose, sharp and bitter, and I let a soft groan escape. She came in, her robe brushing the floor, eyes barely meeting mine. "You need water?" she asked, almost distractedly. Almost. That small pause, the hesitation in her voice, told me something. I spent the morning in bed, pretending to drift in and out of sleep, listening. The house was quiet, the hum of the fridge, the distant traffic outside, the occasional creak of the floorboards. I imagined the people who might care, the ones whose voices I would hear, the footsteps racing toward my room. But the only sound was hers, moving through the house with deliberate calm, whispering to someone, or something, I couldn't yet hear. By noon, I felt a pang of satisfaction. My message was out there, unspoken but clear. Who would show up? Who would notice? Who actually cared? I closed my eyes and let my ears catch every sound, every subtle hint of attention, or indifference. And then, just as my pulse quickened with anticipation, I heard it, a whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. "The poison has started working." I froze, my chest tightening, my ears straining. It wasn't meant for me to hear yet, I thought. This wasn't part of the plan, but it was real. And that's when I realized, this game I started to see who cared had just turned into something I might not control. The whisper clung to the walls long after it was spoken, a shadow crawling through the room. My heart slammed against my ribs as I sat up, pretending to stir from sleep, but my mind was racing. Did she say what I thought she said? I forced myself to stay still, letting the act of weakness continue, while every nerve in my body screamed for clarity. I heard her footsteps retreat, soft but certain, fading down the hall. I wanted to follow, to confront her, to demand the truth, but I couldn't give away that I'd heard. I had to move carefully like a soldier in enemy territory, mapping every creak, every shift of light, every faint murmur. By afternoon, the house felt like a trap. The smell of her perfume lingered in the air, sharp and unsettling, mixed with the faint tang of antiseptic from the kitchen. My stomach churned, not from sickness, but from dread. I thought about the dinner table later, the casual conversations, the way our kids might drift in and out, oblivious. No one really cares until it's too late, I realized, and the thought hit harder than any feigned fever. I tested her again. I called out softly, voice shaky, pretending to cough. She appeared, brisk and composed, but her eyes flicked to mine in a way that made my skin crawl. No sympathy, no worry, only a practiced calm. The whisper replayed in my mind. The poison has started working. Was it metaphor? Was it literal? I didn't dare move too fast. Every instinct screamed danger, but I had to know. I had to survive the next hours, figure out what game was being played in the shadowed corners of my own home. And somewhere deep in me, a new plan started to form. Not to see who cared anymore, but to find out exactly who was trying to hurt me. I stayed in bed longer than usual that evening, listening to the soft hum of the air conditioner and the muted ticking of the wall clock. The house felt different, heavier, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. I knew I couldn't ignore what I'd overheard. The whisper, "The poison has started working," kept replaying in my head, slicing through every attempt to calm myself. I didn't know if it was meant literally or figuratively, but either way, it was a line I couldn't unhear. By mid-afternoon I was restless. I needed proof, or at least clarity. I slipped out of bed, careful not to make a sound, and moved through the hall with the precision of a man accustomed to measuring his every step. The smell of her perfume lingered faintly in the air, a sharp, almost medicinal scent that made my stomach twist. I followed the trail into the kitchen, scanning for anything out of place. Cups, plates, even the trash, they all seemed normal, yet my instincts screamed otherwise. My pulse quickened with every subtle noise. The refrigerator humming, the dishwasher droning in the background. the faint creak of the floor beneath her weight somewhere else in the house. I found her in the living room, sitting on the couch with a book, the corners of her mouth curved in that quiet, almost imperceptible smile. It was calm, controlled, and maddeningly normal. I pretended to struggle to get out of bed as if the mere act of walking drained me. "I don't feel good," I muttered, voice hoarse, fingers gripping the edge of the counter. She looked up from her book, and my stomach dropped. No panic, no concern, just that same unreadable calm. "Do you need water?" she asked. Her tone was soft, polite, almost loving, but underneath it was something else. Calculation. I forced myself to nod weakly, leaning on the counter, letting my act carry the weight. But inside, my mind was racing. What poison? Was this her? Was someone else involved? Every horror movie I'd ever seen rushed into my thoughts, but I tried to keep it grounded. I had to move carefully. Panic would only give her the upper hand. After she left to fetch water, I slipped into the study, the one room I always kept locked but where she had never questioned my privacy. My fingers rifled through drawers, scanning for anything unusual. Prescriptions, letters, anything that could explain what I'd just heard. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, familiar and safe, yet now it felt like a trap. Nothing. Not a single clue. I sank into the chair, my hands gripping the armrests, trying to steady my racing thoughts. Every scenario played out in my mind, each one darker than the last. Was I imagining it? Was this some cruel twist of fate? I had always thought I knew my wife, the woman I'd built a life with. But now, every glance, every word, every movement felt like it could conceal a secret I wasn't meant to know. Night fell, and with it, the house grew silent. My children were asleep, the street outside empty and quiet. I could hear the faint click of doors closing, the whisper of her footsteps across the floor. I stayed awake, listening, straining to catch any hint of movement, any whisper that would tell me whether I was truly in danger or simply unraveling under my own paranoia. The whisper echoed again in my mind, louder this time. The poison has started working. Finally, I knew I had to act. Pretending to be sick had been one thing, a test of care and attention, a way to see who noticed me when I was vulnerable. But now, the lines had blurred. The game was no longer about who would care. It was about who might want me gone. I had to protect myself, to find out the truth before it was too late. I set my plan. I would document everything, every whisper, every movement, every oddity. I would watch her without her knowing, stay one step ahead, and gather evidence. No more pretending weakness for the sake of attention. Now, survival was the only act that mattered. And deep inside, beneath the fear and suspicion, a spark of determination lit me. I would uncover the truth, and if someone was trying to harm me, I would ensure they would pay for every shadowed step and every whispered word. By the time I finally lay down that night, exhausted yet wired with adrenaline, I knew one thing for certain. Nothing in my life would ever feel safe again. And yet, a cold, sharp sense of purpose settled over me. I was no longer just testing who cared. I was testing who was capable of betrayal, and I intended to find out. The next morning I woke before the sun, my body stiff, my mind sharper than it had been in months. The whisper from yesterday still echoed in my head, louder now, burning through any residue of doubt. I had no choice but to move carefully, silently, like a man navigating a minefield. Every step I took was deliberate, every sound measured. I had become both predator and prey in my own home. I started in the kitchen, scanning every cabinet, every drawer, every nook where something sinister could be hidden. The morning light streamed through the blinds, casting long, narrow shadows across the linoleum floor. My eyes caught a faint shimmer at the back of the spice shelf. At first I thought it was my imagination, sunlight bouncing off a glass jar, but I moved closer. It was a small vial, tucked between cumin and paprika. No label. My hand trembled as I picked it up. The liquid inside was clear, slightly viscous, and smelled faintly metallic. My stomach turned. Could this be what she whispered about? I stuffed the vial into my jacket pocket and forced myself to act casual. My wife came into the kitchen, humming softly, a mug of coffee in her hand. Her eyes flicked toward me, and I caught that same calculating look. She didn't speak, just nodded slightly and left, leaving the coffee steaming in my hand. I could feel my pulse in my throat. She was hiding something, and I had just found the first tangible clue. I knew I couldn't confront her. Not yet. I had to know what I was dealing with. I grabbed my laptop and started cataloging everything. My wife's recent purchases, our bills, any correspondence that seemed unusual. Patterns emerged quickly. A few unusual charges at medical suppliers, some deliveries logged under a name I didn't recognize, and a courier that had shown up twice in the last week. The pieces were coming together, each one more alarming than the last. By afternoon, I was pacing the living room, my mind spinning through every possibility. I thought about my children, sleeping upstairs, blissfully unaware. Could I protect them if it came to that? Could I protect myself? I realized I couldn't rely on anyone else. No friends, no family, only me. I had been naive, assuming my wife loved me as I loved her. Now every smile, every tender touch, every whisper I'd trusted felt like it might have been a mask. I decided to test her subtly. That evening, I collapsed in the living room, clutching my chest as if pain had struck me suddenly. She rushed to my side, her movements fluid, almost practiced, and I caught the tiniest flicker of something. Was it fear or satisfaction? Hard to tell. "Are you okay?" she asked, voice calm, controlled. I nodded weakly, letting the act continue, but inside I was screaming. Her calm was suffocating, her detachment terrifying. Later, when she went to bed, I stayed up, sifting through the files on my laptop. I cross-referenced the deliveries with the small vial I'd found. The connection was chilling. The vial matched the shipment from 2 days ago. Whoever had sent it knew exactly where to find it, and she had access. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I was dealing with a calculated, patient adversary, someone willing to use subtle, quiet methods to test me, to weaken me, before striking fully. I couldn't sleep. I wandered the house, tracing her routines, memorizing the small, silent gestures she made, cataloging every sound, the hum of the refrigerator, the whisper of the HVAC, the faint click of her shoes on the hardwood. Every moment became a clue, every movement a possible threat. My senses sharpened. I noticed the faint scent of almonds on her hands, a subtle, almost unnoticeable smell that made my stomach churn. Poison. I was sure of it now. By the time dawn crept through the blinds again, I had made a plan. I wouldn't confront her directly. Not yet. I needed evidence, a way to catch her in the act without tipping her off. I would record, follow, observe. I would survive this, and when I did, she would no longer have the upper hand. The whisper that had terrified me yesterday was now my fuel. It drove me, sharpened me, and made me relentless. I glanced at the vial one last time before hiding it in a secure place. My hands were steady now, my mind cold and calculating. The game had shifted. No longer was I merely pretending to be sick to see who cared. Now I was awake, aware, and preparing to fight for my life. And deep inside, a fire lit itself. I would not just survive. I would turn the tables, and she would see that underestimating me had been the gravest mistake of her life. The next few days became a blur of observation, calculation, and quiet paranoia. I moved through the house like a shadow, listening for the faintest whisper, the slightest irregularity. Every step she took, every casual gesture, every soft hum while cleaning or cooking became data. My senses were on high alert. I could hear the faint rustle of the sheets as she made the bed, the almost imperceptible creak of the stairs under her weight, the soft click of her shoes against the hardwood. It was exhausting, but I couldn't afford to relax. Not for a second. I had set up a small camera in the kitchen, hidden behind the decorative bowl on the counter. It was crude, but it would give me a record of her movements while I feigned sleep or weakness elsewhere. I reviewed the footage obsessively, frame by frame, watching for anything unusual. And then, late one afternoon, I saw it. She poured a liquid from a small vial into my glass of water. My stomach lurched, a cold sweat breaking across my back. The act was so quiet, so deliberate, so careful. It sent a shiver down my spine. She didn't even glance around. It was methodical, precise, professional. I felt a surge of anger, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't confront her yet. I needed more evidence, I needed to understand the why. Why would she do this? We had a life together, a family. I thought I knew her. But that image shattered with one quiet, lethal gesture. I pulled the footage onto my laptop, making multiple copies and encrypting them. The proof was there, undeniable, and it terrified me to see it. I decided I had to know what she was planning. That night, I pretended to fall into a fitful sleep, letting her think her plan was progressing. From the shadows of the bedroom, I watched her move silently toward the kitchen. I followed her as discreetly as I could, noting her rhythm, her patterns, her confidence. The familiarity of our home became a trap, every corner a potential danger, every doorway a place where betrayal could hide. I confronted the psychological reality of the situation. She wasn't just testing me. This was intentional, deliberate. She had been planning it, manipulating our daily life, waiting for the right moment. The whisper I had overheard, the words I thought I imagined, were real. She believed she could control the outcome, control me, control everything in a silence I could barely break. The next day, I began preparing contingencies. I separated the children's meals from mine, made sure nothing I consumed could be tampered with. I ordered tests online, discreetly, to confirm my suspicions. Each precaution, each small measure, felt like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. My mind was sharp, focused, but the emotional toll was immense. Fear and betrayal mingled with adrenaline, creating a tension that made sleep impossible. And then there was the whisper again, repeating in my mind, haunting every action. The poison has started working. I realized I couldn't just wait. I had to take control. I set up more cameras, monitored every delivery, every movement. I even rehearsed scenarios in my head, how I would confront her, how I would protect myself if she realized I knew, how I would act if she tried to finish what she started. I started noticing the subtleties of her behavior that I had missed before, the way she lingered by the windows when she thought I wasn't watching, the careful timing of her errands, the almost imperceptible tightness in her jaw when she thought I was asleep. The house had become a chessboard, and she was making moves I hadn't anticipated. But now, I wasn't just reacting. I was anticipating. I was planning. By the fifth day, I had collected enough evidence to be sure. Not just suspicion, not just fear, but proof. And with that proof came a strange, cold clarity. I could no longer see her as the woman I had married. I could only see her as the threat she had become. And yet, beneath the fear, there was a spark of determination, a dangerous, sharp awareness that I would not be outmaneuvered. That night I sat alone in the living room, the house silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I held the vial in my hand, the clear liquid reflecting the dim light. I thought about confrontation, about strategy, about survival. One thing was certain. I was awake now, fully aware, fully prepared. I had seen the whisper in action, traced its steps, documented its intentions. And when the moment came, I would act, not in panic, not in desperation, but with precision. I leaned back in the chair, heart still racing, mind calculating every possible scenario. The fear had not gone away, but it had transformed into something sharper, cleaner. Resolve. I would not be poisoned. I would not be betrayed in my own home. And when the truth finally came out, she would see that underestimating me had been her gravest mistake. The following morning, the air in the house felt different, heavier, charged, like it knew we were on the edge of something. I moved cautiously, walking on the balls of my feet, every muscle tense, every sense alert. The whisper still haunted me, reverberating in the back of my mind. The poison has started working. I could feel its echo in every movement, in every glance toward her, in every heartbeat. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about reclaiming control of my life from someone who had turned intimacy into a weapon. I decided to step up my surveillance. I installed a tiny, discreet camera in the hallway, angled toward the kitchen where most of the activity occurred. I watched as she moved through her morning routine, a practiced rhythm that had once felt comforting, but now felt sinister. Her hands were steady as she made coffee, her face calm, almost serene. She didn't look like someone plotting betrayal. She looked like someone completely normal, and that was what made it terrifying. I reminded myself, predators hide in plain sight. By mid-morning, I tested her again, subtly. I reached for the glass I suspected had been tampered with the previous week. She saw me, just a flicker of acknowledgement in her eyes, and I froze. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was a calculation, a quiet assessment, and just like that I realized she knew, or at least suspected, I had begun noticing. My pulse accelerated. The game had changed. She wasn't just hiding anymore, she was adapting. I had to act carefully. I didn't want confrontation yet. That would be too early, too visible. Instead, I staged another weak episode, letting her think the poison, or the fear, was still in control. I slumped onto the couch, letting my breathing come in shallow, uneven bursts. She moved to my side immediately, gently brushing my hair back from my forehead. That small, tender gesture, which might have been sweet under normal circumstances, now felt like a mask covering intent. I could see the precision in her movements, the way she measured each touch. The entire day became a delicate dance. I moved as if half alive, documenting, noting, remembering. Every sound she made, every subtle shift in her posture, was recorded in my mind. The scent of the coffee, faint traces of perfume, even the way she tapped her fingers against the counter. It all became data, clues in a puzzle that I refused to let defeat me. Each step I took was a calculation. Would she notice if I lingered here? Could I catch her reaching for something she shouldn't? The stakes had risen to a level I hadn't anticipated when I first decided to feign sickness. Late afternoon, I caught something in the hallway. She paused, turning toward the stairs with a faint glint in her hand. I held my breath, heart hammering, and watched as she moved toward the pantry. My pulse shot as she opened a drawer I had already inspected dozens of times. Her hand hovered over the contents as if she were considering something, and then she pulled a small packet from behind the flour canister. A packet I hadn't seen before. She tucked it into her pocket and walked away as if nothing had happened. That was the moment I realized she was escalating. The whisper had been a warning, not just a signal of my vulnerability, but of her intent. She wasn't just testing me. She was planning, adjusting, escalating. And if I didn't act soon, the situation could spiral out of control. I had to gather undeniable proof, but I also had to prepare for the moment when she realized I knew. I had to be ready for confrontation, for the final reveal, for survival. By nightfall, I had laid out my plan. I would set a trap, record everything, and ensure that when the truth came out, I would have evidence that could not be denied. I went through my routines mentally, where I would move, when I would act, how I would respond if she tried anything. Each scenario played out in my head like a rehearsal. Fear was still there, gnawing at the edges, but it was tempered now with clarity and determination. I had become methodical, precise, vigilant. I looked at the vial again, the small, clear container that had upended my entire world. It gleamed under the dim light of the living room lamp, a symbol of both danger and knowledge. I realized, with a cold certainty, that I was no longer just pretending to be sick to test attention. I was awake, fully alert, and prepared to confront the betrayal in my own home. Every whisper, every shadow, every subtle movement had taught me one thing: I could not afford to hesitate. The moment of truth was coming, and when it did, I had to be ready to act with precision, courage, and relentless focus. The house was quiet, my children asleep, the night pressing down like a heavy weight. But inside me, adrenaline and determination burned bright. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was preparing to reclaim my life, and when the time came, I would ensure that every calculated move she had made against me would be turned back on her. The next morning, I woke with the taste of iron in my mouth and a steady, cold determination running through my veins. The whisper still echoed, a relentless drumbeat in my mind. The poison has started working, but now it carried a different weight, a challenge, a demand for vigilance. I had spent days observing, recording, and planning. Every move she made, every small gesture, every whispered step had been cataloged, analyzed, and turned into data I could act on. Today, the trap would begin. I started by preparing the living room, the main stage for her next move. I set out glasses, each filled with water, making sure one of them contained the vial I had recovered. I left subtle evidence in plain sight. An open drawer here, a slightly ajar cabinet there, carefully planting breadcrumbs to test her reaction. It wasn't just about catching her in the act anymore. It was about forcing a reveal, drawing out the truth without risking my life prematurely. By mid-morning she appeared, moving with that calm, almost serene precision that had haunted me for days. She smiled faintly at me, a slow, measured curve of her lips that should have felt familiar, comforting even, but it didn't. Not anymore. Every instinct in my body screamed that this smile was a mask, hiding intent. I held her gaze, letting the seconds stretch, letting her realize, subtly, that I was aware. She didn't flinch, she didn't hesitate. She simply adjusted the sleeve of her robe and moved toward the kitchen. I followed silently, keeping a careful distance, noting her rhythm, the way she handled each utensil, every subtle motion. And then I saw it. Her hand hovered over one of the glasses I had set out, fingers brushing against the edge as if testing the surface. My heart surged, but I stayed calm, letting my own mask of weakness continue to hide the intensity behind my gaze. She poured water into the glass, and my pulse quickened, not out of fear, but anticipation. She was following the pattern I had predicted, and now I had the evidence I needed. I retreated to the study, where the cameras were recording, my mind racing through the implications. The footage would be irrefutable. Every move, every subtle act, every whisper of intent would be captured in digital permanence. I replayed the scenario in my head, timing her steps, calculating how she would react if she realized I had observed her. I had prepared contingencies for every eventuality: confrontation, denial, panic, but also for resistance, deflection, and even aggression. Hours passed like this, a tense, delicate dance of observation and preparation. Every sound she made, from the soft click of her shoes against the floor to the faint rustle of the blinds, became significant. The house felt alive, aware of the game being played within its walls. Even the hum of the refrigerator seemed louder, charged with suspense, as if the very air conspired to reveal the truth. By evening, I had devised a subtle escalation. I collapsed in the living room again, this time clutching my chest with more intensity, letting my breathing come in shallow, erratic bursts. She rushed to my side immediately, her movements fluid, precise, almost too smooth. And then, the critical moment. I pretended to reach for the glass containing the vial. Her hand froze, just for a fraction of a second, and then she withdrew. That hesitation was my confirmation. She knew. She had been caught, even if she didn't fully admit it yet. I watched her. Every detail burned into my memory. The slight narrowing of her eyes, the faint tension in her shoulders, the calculated stillness that masked her inner calculation. I felt a strange combination of fear, anger, and exhilaration. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was gaining control, and I could see, in that brief moment, that the balance of power had begun to shift. As night fell, the house became eerily silent. The children slept upstairs, oblivious to the storm brewing below. I reviewed the camera footage one last time, confirming every suspicion, every nuance, every subtle act that proved intent. The evidence was clear, undeniable, and the plan moving forward was sharp and unambiguous. I would confront her, but not recklessly. I would ensure that every calculated move, every hidden step she had taken against me, would be laid bare. I sat alone in the living room, the faint glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the intensity of focus. I realized that I had transformed over these past days, from a man testing who cared, into a man fully aware of the threat, fully prepared to act, and fully committed to reclaiming control of his life. And deep inside, beneath the adrenaline and the tension, a cold, precise resolve settled. She would not escape, she would not manipulate, and she would understand, finally, that I was no longer vulnerable. The trap was set, the evidence was secured, and the moment of truth loomed just beyond the night. Tomorrow, everything would change. The house was quiet the next morning, but I could feel it humming with anticipation, as if it knew what was coming. My nerves were taut, my senses sharpened, each sound amplified in the stillness. I moved carefully, deliberately, watching, listening, waiting. The whisper still lingered in my mind. The poison has started working. But now it didn't terrify me. It motivated me. The tables were ready to turn, and I intended to make her feel the weight of every move she had made against me. I set the scene in the living room, arranging the glasses, the evidence, the subtle clues just so. The cameras were rolling, every angle calculated to capture her reactions and intentions. I wanted nothing to escape my observation. I had rehearsed every step, every motion, every potential response. My chest felt tight, but my mind was clear, razor sharp, alive with the precision of strategy. This wasn't just survival anymore. It was justice. She appeared mid-morning, her face calm, composed, the mask she had perfected over weeks firmly in place. She greeted me with that faint smile, the one that once made me feel safe, warm, loved, but now filled me with icy resolve. I didn't respond with emotion. I stayed still, letting her think she still had control, letting her underestimate the depths of my awareness. I watched as her gaze flicked toward the glasses on the table, and I caught that imperceptible hesitation, a twitch of recognition, the first crack in her armor. I spoke softly, almost lethargically, letting my voice carry the illusion of weakness. "I don't feel right," I murmured, my body slumping slightly toward the couch. Her eyes widened fractionally, and she moved closer, hand extended, touching my arm in a gesture that should have been comforting. But I didn't flinch. I didn't act. I let the moment stretch, every second loaded with tension, every subtle gesture magnified by the high stakes. Then it happened. She reached for the glass containing the vial. My heart pounded, but I didn't move yet. I watched her every movement, memorizing the rhythm, the precision, the calmness that belied intent. She paused, fingers hovering over the rim, and I caught it. A micro-expression, a flash of calculation in her eyes. She knew I was onto her, or at least suspected. And that's when I acted. I moved suddenly but controlled, grabbing her wrist with firm precision. She flinched, not in surprise but in calculation, realizing her timing had been observed. "Enough," I said, voice low, steady, carrying the weight of every day of fear, every moment of betrayal. "I know what you've been doing." The words hung in the air like a guillotine poised to fall. I could feel her pulse quicken, the tension in her body, the subtle shift of control slipping away. For a moment, she said nothing, her lips parting slightly, as if searching for a response that didn't exist. I held her gaze, unblinking, unwavering, letting the cameras silently record every detail, every micro-reaction. The room was thick with unspoken accusation, the kind that doesn't need words to strike. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction, not joy, not relief, but clarity. The predator had been caught, and the prey had learned to fight. "You thought I didn't notice," I continued, voice sharp now, each word deliberate. "You thought you could manipulate, control, and hide your intentions. But I've watched, recorded, anticipated every move. And now," I let the pause stretch, feeling the tension coil and uncoil like a spring in the room. "The truth is out." She tried to respond, to deny, to twist, but I was ready. I had rehearsed these moments, predicted her words, her defenses. I held up the vial, the evidence of her intentions, and her eyes widened. For the first time in days, her mask faltered. I saw the flicker of fear, just a momentary crack in her carefully maintained composure. But it was enough to know that control had shifted, enough to understand that the game was no longer hers to command. I kept my voice steady, controlled, each word a scalpel cutting through weeks of deception. "You underestimated me. You underestimated my awareness, my resolve, and that mistake," I let my gaze lock with hers, unflinching, "will cost you everything." The room fell silent after that, heavy, suffocating, charged with tension. She realized, in that moment, that I had not only survived but adapted, evolved, become sharper, more vigilant. The whisper that had once haunted me now felt like fuel, driving me, strengthening my resolve. The poison, the game, the manipulation, it all ended here. The evidence, the surveillance, the calculated preparation, It had been more than defense. It had been empowerment. By nightfall, the confrontation had left the house charged with a new energy. I had taken control, reclaimed the power that had been threatened, and ensured that every action, every whispered intention, every act of betrayal had been exposed. She no longer had the upper hand. I was no longer a man testing care or attention. I was awake, aware, prepared, and victorious in the quiet, deliberate sense that matters most. The trap had worked. The predator had been caught. And I had proven, in the stark clarity of cold observation and unyielding resolve, that underestimating me had been her gravest mistake. The house felt quieter than it had in days, almost too quiet. The confrontation had shifted the energy, leaving a tense, brittle stillness in its wake. I moved carefully through the living room, picking up the glasses I had staged for the trap, handling them with deliberate precision. Every surface, every shadow, every object suddenly seemed loaded with significance. The game was over, or at least this phase of it, but the consequences were only beginning to ripple through the house. She sat on the couch, rigid, silent, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere in the distance. For the first time since the whisper had reached my ears, she didn't move with calm assurance. Her mask had slipped, revealing a fracture I had been waiting for. I felt a mixture of triumph and unease. Victory was intoxicating, but it was tempered by the knowledge that the aftermath could be unpredictable. People like her don't break easily. They recalculate, adapt, retaliate. I placed the vial on the table between us, letting the weight of its presence fill the space. The evidence was undeniable, irrefutable. She didn't reach for it, didn't speak. She simply sat there, a statue of control finally cracking under scrutiny. I watched the subtle changes in her posture, the tightening of her shoulders, the way her fingers twitched, the shallow rhythm of her breathing. These were the small betrayals of someone suddenly aware of vulnerability. I broke the silence first, my voice low but steady. You thought I was weak. You thought pretending sickness was enough to hide your intentions. But I saw it. I recorded it. I anticipated every move. Each word landed carefully, a hammer striking the fragile shell she had built around herself. I wasn't screaming. I wasn't pleading. I was asserting clarity, drawing a line she could no longer ignore. She finally spoke, her voice soft, almost disbelieving. I didn't think you'd notice. The words were fragile, stripped of the confidence she had worn like armor for weeks. I could hear the calculation in her attempt to soften them, to minimize, but it was transparent. Her control had slipped too far to recover in a single gesture. I leaned back, studying her, letting silence amplify the weight of my presence, letting every unspoken accusation hang like a blade between us. The room felt smaller, charged with tension, with every heartbeat counting twice. I thought about the children upstairs, about the normalcy of their sleep, and about the precariousness of what could have happened if I hadn't acted. Fear sharpened my clarity. Survival had become instinct, strategy, and now, moral reckoning. I had moved from testing care to uncovering intent, from passive observation to deliberate confrontation. She shifted, finally meeting my gaze. Her eyes were wary now, cautious, calculating again, but no longer fully confident. "What do you want me to do?" she asked, voice tight, almost fragile. I held my stare, letting the silence do the work she had failed to maintain herself. Control had shifted. I had anticipated her, prepared, documented, and acted. Now she was forced into my reality, where truth wasn't negotiable. I spoke carefully, deliberately. I want honesty. I want accountability. And I want the assurance that no one in this house, including me, is ever in danger again because of your choices. Each phrase was weighted, precise. I wasn't asking. I was asserting a boundary that had been tested, violated, and now reclaimed. The power had returned to me, steady, calm, unshakable. The hours stretched as we sat in that tense silence, both of us aware of the delicate balance now established. I could see the wheels turning in her mind, the recalculations, the internal struggle between denial and admission. Finally, she nodded slightly, a small gesture, but one heavy with meaning. It was acknowledgement, not submission, not apology, but recognition. She understood at last, that she had been seen, exposed, and countered. As night fell, I moved through the house carefully, securing evidence, resetting spaces, and reinforcing boundaries. The adrenaline from the confrontation had left a lingering hum, but now it was tempered by a quiet satisfaction. The predator had been confronted, and the immediate threat neutralized. I could finally breathe, knowing I had acted decisively, with clarity and without hesitation. Lying in bed that night, I stared at the ceiling, every nerve still alert, every thought cataloging the day's events. I had learned something vital about vigilance, awareness, and the thin line between love and danger. I had tested care and attention, only to discover betrayal hidden in the most intimate corners of my life. And now, having faced it, I realized that survival demanded more than instinct. It demanded strategy, resolve, and the courage to act when the moment was right. By the time sleep finally came, it was heavy, deserved, and wary. Tomorrow the house would feel different, tenser perhaps, but safer. The whisper no longer haunted me as a threat. It was a reminder of the stakes, a signal of what vigilance could uncover, and proof that underestimating me had been the gravest mistake she could make. I had reclaimed my life, and now I intended to keep it. The morning after the confrontation was different. The house seemed quieter, but it was the heavy, expectant kind of quiet that makes every creak, every hum, every distant noise feel amplified. I moved through the rooms methodically, checking cameras, reviewing the footage, and noting the small, subtle signs that indicated she was recalibrating her approach. She had been caught, exposed, and now she was thinking, plotting, adapting. I could feel it in the way she moved, measured, and avoided my gaze. Every subtle shift told me she understood the balance of power had changed, even if she hadn't fully admitted it. I started the day by securing the spaces I frequented the most: the kitchen, the office, my study. I examined every object, every surface, every potential place where she might attempt to manipulate, hide, or threaten again. The vial I had found weeks ago was locked away in a safe spot, along with the recordings, the evidence, everything I needed to protect myself and maintain leverage. The act of preparation gave me a strange, cold satisfaction. I was no longer at the mercy of uncertainty. I was in control. She emerged into the kitchen mid-morning, careful, deliberate, her movements almost painfully precise. I could see her testing the waters, gauging how much I had learned, how alert I had become. She poured herself coffee, and the faint smell of it mixed with her perfume in the air. A scent that once signaled comfort now felt like a warning. I watched her silently, letting her sense the scrutiny without giving away the full extent of my awareness. This was no longer about catching her in a single act. It was about establishing dominance, creating a reality where manipulation and deception had consequences. We exchanged few words that morning, and each was carefully measured. She asked casually about errands, about the children, about mundane things, as if trying to maintain a veneer of normalcy. I answered with deliberate neutrality, letting my calm awareness speak louder than any accusation could. Her questions were soft, calculated, probing. My responses were steady, observant, withholding judgment but leaving no space for deception. Every small interaction was a silent battle of control, and I felt the subtle thrill of reclaiming authority over the household I had once shared blindly. By midday, I decided it was time to push the boundaries slightly, to test her reaction under controlled conditions. I left out minor objects, rearranged small items in the kitchen, and created subtle inconsistencies she would notice. Each small adjustment was a signal. I was aware, I was alert, and I could respond to any attempt at manipulation. I could see her noticing, her eyes flicking subtly toward the changes, her hands pausing mid-motion, a tiny frown forming, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It was confirmation that she understood I had evolved beyond the man she thought she could control. The tension in the house was palpable, but it was now under my control. Fear and anxiety had been replaced by calculated observation. I could act, respond, and dominate without losing clarity. I spent the afternoon reviewing every moment from the previous days, cataloging every micro-expression, every hesitation, every subtle shift in her behavior. Each data point built a larger picture, one that allowed me to anticipate, predict, and maintain an unassailable position. By evening, she finally spoke openly, cautiously, her voice soft and tentative. I see you've been thorough," she said, almost as if acknowledging my vigilance without fully admitting wrongdoing. I remained silent for a moment, letting the weight of my gaze and my quiet presence communicate what words could not. I wasn't angry. I was deliberate. I was powerful. I had reclaimed the space she had tried to poison, both literally and figuratively. I decided then to address the emotional stakes directly. I sat across from her at the kitchen table, calm but unwavering, and spoke with measured precision. "This house, this family, and my life are not yours to manipulate," I said, letting each word carry the weight of weeks of observation, fear, and preparation. "You underestimated me. You believed I would remain passive. That mistake is yours, and it cannot happen again." She nodded slowly, the first sign of humility, perhaps even recognition. She understood that the dynamic had shifted irreversibly. The night was long and quiet, the children asleep, the house cloaked in shadowed silence. I moved through the home, reinforcing boundaries, securing evidence, and ensuring that the traps I had set remained intact. The sense of control was intoxicating, but it was tempered by awareness. This wasn't the end. It was a pivot point. I had survived, asserted authority, and forced acknowledgement, but the psychological aftermath was only beginning. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I reflected on the journey. I had started with a simple test, feigning sickness to see who would care. That experiment had revealed betrayal, danger, and the fragility of trust. But it had also revealed something stronger: my own resilience, my capacity for vigilance, and my ability to act decisively under pressure. The whisper that had once terrified me now reminded me of my own strength. I had seen betrayal, faced it, and reclaimed power, and I knew, deep in my bones, that I would never allow myself to be undermined again. Tomorrow the house would continue to shift, the tension would linger, and the subtle battles would persist. But I was prepared. I was awake. I was aware. I was no longer merely testing care or attention. I had become the master of my own survival, the architect of my own security, and the force that ensured betrayal could no longer thrive in the shadows of my life. The morning light felt sharper than usual, cutting through the blinds and casting long, narrow shadows across the living room floor. I moved deliberately, silently, my senses alert to every nuance in the house. After the confrontation, the quiet had changed. It wasn't peaceful. It was charged, like the air itself had memory, like the walls were holding their breath, waiting for the next move. I had reclaimed control, yes, but the subtle danger lingered. Trust had been fractured, and vigilance had to be constant. I began the day by reviewing the footage from the cameras again, meticulously checking every angle, every reaction, every small gesture she had made. Patterns emerged, timings, routines, repeated behaviors, and I cataloged them. It was almost like mapping an enemy's battlefield, and the clarity it brought steadied my nerves. I realized that her subtle attempts at manipulation weren't just impulsive. They were calculated, deliberate, and persistent. I had been lucky to notice before she acted fully. By mid-morning, I began implementing further precautions. I segregated everything I consumed from the rest of the household, labeling my food and drinks carefully, and storing them in locked compartments. I traced every package that had arrived over the past month, noting deliveries, schedules, and any anomaly. I even set up small, inconspicuous alarms and sensors near high-risk areas, my personal safeguard measures. It wasn't paranoia, it was preparation. She had shown me the extent of her planning, and I refused to leave anything to chance. She moved through the house with calculated caution, clearly aware of my awareness. Every step, every glance, every small gesture had changed. I could sense the tension she carried, how she adjusted when I was near, how she delayed movements when I entered a room, how she kept her hands visible and her expressions neutral. She was testing me now, silently, to see how far my vigilance extended, and I welcomed it. I had grown sharper, faster, and more deliberate. I approached the subject cautiously, choosing my words with precision. "We need to talk about boundaries," I said, my voice calm but firm, as she paused mid-step, a subtle tremor passing through her posture. "What happened was not acceptable. What you tried to do, whatever your reason, cannot happen again." She looked away briefly, then met my gaze, her eyes registering comprehension without argument. She had realized the power dynamic had shifted, and she had no choice but to acknowledge it. Throughout the afternoon, I expanded my measures. I installed additional discrete cameras, moved sensitive items to secure locations, and began keeping detailed logs of interactions and movements. Every step was documented. Every whisper of intention or subtle gesture was recorded, in case the situation escalated. I wasn't doing this for paranoia or spite. I was doing it to maintain the safety of my household and ensure control remained firmly in my hands. The children remained blissfully unaware of the tension, but their safety became my focus. I reorganized schedules, monitored their meals, and ensured that any potential exposure to risk was eliminated. I realized that betrayal could ripple outward, affecting everything I cared about. Protecting myself was no longer enough. Protecting them was paramount. Each precaution I implemented strengthened not just my position, but the stability of the entire household. By evening, I allowed myself a moment of reflection. The confrontation had shifted everything, but it hadn't removed the psychological residue. I could see her recalculating, reassessing every move she made in the house. She wasn't passive. She wasn't broken. She was adapting, but so was I. I had moved from reaction to strategy, from fear to deliberate control. I had learned the value of observation, anticipation, and preparation, and I was committed to maintaining this vigilance indefinitely. As night fell, the house grew quiet again, but this time it was deliberate. The children slept, the shadows stretched long across the floors, and every corner felt charged with meaning. I moved through the rooms one last time, checking locks, monitoring sensors, and ensuring that the environment was secure. I was no longer merely surviving. I was architecting a fortress of awareness and control, one built on strategy, foresight, and precision. Finally, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I allowed myself a measure of satisfaction. I had faced betrayal, exposed intent, and reclaimed authority over my life and home. The whisper that had once threatened me now served as a reminder of resilience, vigilance, and strength. I had evolved from a man testing care to a man fully aware, fully prepared, and fully in control. Tomorrow the house would continue to shift, the tension would persist, but I would remain alert, unshakable, and in command. Morning came with a brittle clarity, the sunlight cutting sharp lines across the living room floor, illuminating the subtle tension still hanging in the air. I moved through the house with deliberate precision, checking every camera feed, reviewing every interaction from the previous days. The confrontation had shifted the power dynamic, but vigilance couldn't end. She had been exposed, yes, but the potential for escalation still lingered. Every movement, every breath, every whisper now carried significance. I began by reviewing the logs I had kept meticulously. Deliveries, unusual purchases, her movements within the house, even small gestures she had made toward the children or the kitchen. Patterns emerged that confirmed what I had suspected. She had been calculating, deliberate, and patient. Each step she took had been intentional, and each moment I had observed and documented had allowed me to neutralize her advantage. I felt a cold satisfaction knowing that nothing escaped my awareness now. By late morning, I began implementing more permanent safeguards. Sensitive items, including the vial and other suspicious materials, were stored in locked compartments I alone could access. I reorganized the kitchen, pantry, and study to ensure that any future attempts at manipulation would be impossible. Every precaution was calculated, precise, designed not just to react but to prevent. I wasn't paranoid. I was prepared. The house had become a controlled environment, and I was the one orchestrating it. She moved through the rooms with calculated caution, acutely aware of my awareness. Every step she took was measured, every glance deliberate. She had learned that subtlety no longer provided cover, that my vigilance had reached a level she could no longer outmaneuver, and yet I could see in her eyes that she was testing boundaries, attempting to gauge the limits of my control. It was a silent dance, a game of micro-movements, and I welcomed it. This was no longer about fear. It was about establishing a clear hierarchy in my home. I addressed the issue directly, calmly, and firmly. "This household runs on trust and accountability," I said, holding her gaze. "Anything that threatens that balance, anything, will not be tolerated. You understand that, don't you?" She hesitated, the faintest flicker of acknowledgement passing over her features. Not submission, not surrender, but recognition. She understood that control had shifted, and that every step she took now fell under my scrutiny. I spent the afternoon reinforcing protective measures around the children. Meal plans were adjusted, schedules reviewed, and access points limited. I realized that betrayal in a household isn't isolated. It ripples, affecting everyone in its path. Protecting myself was only part of the equation. Ensuring their safety and maintaining order became paramount. Each precaution I took, each strategy I implemented, strengthened not just my position, but the stability of the family unit as a whole. Throughout the day, I observed her subtly, noting the recalibrations in her behavior. She moved with more caution, her gestures smaller, more deliberate, as if testing the boundaries I had established. It was both validation and proof of progress. She had acknowledged the shift in power, and I was now dictating the pace, the limits, and the consequences. Every subtle misstep she made was a reminder that vigilance had to remain constant, but it also reinforced my control. As evening approached, I reviewed the cameras one final time, ensuring that every angle had been captured, every action recorded. The evidence was comprehensive, undeniable, and fully within my control. I realized that I had created more than just security. I had established accountability. She could no longer act in shadows, could no longer rely on secrecy. Every intention, every gesture, every potential threat was visible and measurable. That night, I sat alone in the living room, the house quiet except for the faint hum of appliances and the slow rhythm of the children's sleep upstairs. I felt a sense of calm satisfaction, tempered by the awareness that vigilance could not lapse. The whisper that had once signaled danger, "The poison has started working," now resonated differently. It reminded me of the stakes, of the clarity gained through observation and preparation, and of the unyielding resolve required to maintain control. By the time I lay in bed, the weight of strategy, preparation, and awareness settled over me. I had faced betrayal, confronted danger, and reclaimed authority over my life, my home, and my family. The house had been transformed from a site of uncertainty into a controlled environment where safety and accountability prevailed. I was awake, fully aware, and fully prepared for anything she, or anyone, might attempt next. Tomorrow, the work would continue. The vigilance would persist. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a quiet, measured sense of dominance. The predator had been exposed, the threat neutralized, and the boundaries firmly established. And in that stillness, I understood something profound. Survival wasn't just about reacting. It was about anticipating, controlling, and ensuring that no one could ever again threaten the fragile stability of my life. The next morning felt different, charged with a quiet intensity. I moved through the house deliberately, checking cameras and reviewing logs from the previous days. Every subtle gesture, every whispered step, every minor movement was a reminder of the delicate balance I had established. The confrontation had shifted power, but vigilance was still required. The house had been reclaimed, yes, but authority had to be enforced consistently to prevent regression. I began by addressing the tangible elements of control. I retrieved the vial I had locked away, along with other suspicious items I had discovered, and displayed them carefully on the kitchen table. It was deliberate, symbolic, an unspoken message that manipulation, deceit, and betrayal were no longer tolerated. She entered the room and her gaze immediately fell on the objects. For the first time since this began, I saw a flicker of apprehension in her eyes. She understood. She understood that I had anticipated every move, recorded every step, and prepared contingencies for every eventuality. I spoke with a calm, measured authority, ensuring every word carried weight. "These are not merely objects," I said. gesturing toward the vial. They represent choices, actions, and intentions. Actions that threaten the safety and stability of this household. They are now accountable, and so are you. My tone left no room for argument. The shift was complete. Authority had been reasserted, and subtle psychological dominance had been established. She didn't speak immediately. She merely nodded, a small, deliberate gesture, acknowledging the reality of her position. I could see her mind working, recalculating, assessing what steps could be taken to regain influence, or if that was even possible. The power dynamic had shifted decisively, and every action she made from this point forward would be within the boundaries I had set. Her previous confidence had been dismantled, replaced by a wary, calculated caution that I now controlled. I spent the morning reinforcing safety measures throughout the house. I segregated consumables, moved sensitive materials to secure locations, and established redundancies for monitoring high-risk areas. Each measure was strategic, deliberate, and layered. I wasn't acting out of paranoia. I was ensuring the integrity of my environment. She watched, silent but attentive, each of her movements constrained by the awareness that I could see everything, anticipate everything, and respond decisively to any attempt at subversion. By afternoon, I initiated direct accountability. I sat her down at the dining table and began a systematic review of the past week's events. Each suspicious delivery, each subtle manipulation, each whispered attempt at influence was documented, discussed, and addressed. I let her see that the surveillance, the preparation, and the observation were thorough and undeniable. There was no room for ambiguity. Every act of betrayal had been catalogued, and she understood that she could no longer operate in secrecy. Her responses were measured, cautious. She admitted little but acknowledged enough to understand that she could no longer deny reality. The psychological weight of exposure was evident in the slight tremor of her hands, the measured pacing of her breathing, and the careful precision of her words. Each small concession reinforced the authority I had claimed, establishing a new equilibrium in which honesty, accountability, and transparency were no longer negotiable. As evening approached, I reviewed the footage once more, ensuring that every interaction, every subtle gesture, every whisper had been captured. I cataloged it meticulously, creating a framework of evidence and verification that would remain in place indefinitely. This was not just about immediate control. It was about establishing long-term security and stability. I understood that power, once reclaimed, must be maintained, and vigilance could not lapse. The children slept upstairs, unaware of the intricate psychological and strategic dynamics that had unfolded in the home below. Their safety, well-being, and stability were now my primary focus. I moved quietly through the rooms, checking locks, verifying sensors, and reinforcing precautions. Every step I took reinforced the foundation of authority I had painstakingly rebuilt. I was no longer merely reacting. I was preempting, securing, and ensuring that manipulation could no longer thrive in my space. By nightfall, the house had shifted subtly but definitively. The quiet carried weight, a new rhythm established by vigilance and control. She understood the consequences of her actions, and the boundaries were clear and enforced. I felt a measured satisfaction, tempered by awareness that authority requires consistency and attention. The whisper that had once symbolized danger now served as a reminder. Vigilance, preparedness, and decisive action had restored balance. Lying in bed, I reflected on the past weeks, the fear, the betrayal, the confrontation, and now the reclamation of control. I realized that survival was not passive. It required observation, strategy, and unyielding resolve. I had tested care, faced deception, and emerged not only intact, but empowered. The house, the family, and my life were secure, for now, but the lessons would endure. I had learned that trust could be tested, boundaries could be crossed, and betrayal could be engineered. And I had proven that awareness, vigilance, and decisive action were the only defenses against hidden threats. Morning arrived with a strange calm, almost as if the house itself was holding its breath. I moved deliberately through each room, checking the cameras, reviewing logs, and noting the subtle shifts in behavior. The confrontation had passed, accountability had been forced, yet the tension lingered, taut and unyielding. The power dynamic had changed, but vigilance remained essential. Control was not a momentary victory. It was a sustained effort, and I had no intention of letting it slip. She emerged quietly from the bedroom, moving with caution. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time in days, there was no mask of casual composure. There was recognition, acknowledgement of the boundaries now firmly in place. I could see the calculation in her movements, the way she measured each step, each gesture, each word. She was testing the limits, subtly, almost imperceptibly, but I could read it. Every nuance was clear, every pause deliberate. I didn't need her words. Her body language communicated the acknowledgement of authority. I chose my approach carefully. Instead of immediate confrontation or accusation, I allowed the silence to carry weight, letting the atmosphere itself communicate the stakes. She moved to the kitchen, preparing coffee as if performing a ritual, yet every motion was restrained, deliberate, measured. I observed quietly, noting the tension in her shoulders, the careful avoidance of direct eye contact, the way she adjusted the sleeve of her robe multiple times. This was acknowledgement without surrender, recognition without apology. It was the beginning of subtle reconciliation under the weight of dominance. By mid-morning, I decided to address the emotional undercurrents directly. I sat across from her at the dining table, calm and deliberate, voice measured but firm. "We have crossed dangerous lines," I said, letting the words linger. "But we cannot erase the past. What we can do is establish clarity, boundaries, accountability, and respect. Without those, nothing in this house will ever be secure." She listened quietly, her eyes flicking toward the carefully secured vial on the counter, toward the cameras discreetly positioned, and finally back to me. The acknowledgement in her gaze was subtle, but unmistakable. She understood that control had shifted, and the foundation for future interactions had been recalibrated. Throughout the afternoon, I continued subtle reinforcement of authority. I monitored her movements, noting when she adjusted schedules, cleaned areas, or moved objects. Each action was a test of limits, and I responded with measured observation rather than immediate reaction. By reinforcing boundaries through quiet vigilance rather than confrontation, I maintained control while allowing her to navigate the house with awareness. Every interaction became a lesson in accountability, subtle, psychological, unyielding. I also began focusing on restoring a measure of normalcy for the children. They remained oblivious to the tension that had gripped the household. I organized meals, structured activities, and maintained routines to ensure their environment remained safe, stable, and predictable. Protecting them had become paramount, not just physically, but emotionally. The subtle balance of authority I enforced ensured that the household functioned smoothly, while underlying vigilance remained intact. Evening brought a deeper shift. She approached me cautiously, sitting across from me with a soft, tentative voice. I understand the boundaries," she said. The words were carefully measured, lacking the casual confidence of prior days, yet carrying the weight of acknowledgement. I didn't respond immediately. I allowed the silence to reinforce the message. Her recognition, even partial, was proof that the recalibrated power dynamic had taken hold. Control was subtle, psychological, and unyielding. I continued the conversation carefully, establishing clear expectations for the future. "Acknowledgement is the first step," I said. "Action is the next. Every movement, every decision, every gesture must reflect awareness, responsibility, and respect. There will be no exceptions." She nodded slightly, absorbing the weight of the declaration. For the first time, there was no defiance, no subtle manipulation, just quiet acknowledgement under the structure I had established. Later that night, I walked through the house one last time before sleep, checking locks, reviewing cameras, ensuring all precautions remained intact. The environment was secure, the boundaries clear, and the household had shifted into a rhythm of controlled vigilance. The whisper that had once signaled danger, the poison has started working, now served as a reminder of resilience, strategy, and psychological dominance. It was no longer a threat. It was a benchmark of strength. Lying in bed, I reflected on the past weeks. Fear betrayal, confrontation, and accountability had reshaped everything. The house had become a controlled environment where vigilance, observation, and subtle authority maintained stability. I had tested, challenged, and reclaimed my life, and in the process, established the conditions for long-term security. The balance was delicate, but it was mine. Tomorrow, the subtle power play would continue, but I would remain alert, unwavering, and fully in command. Morning arrived quietly, the sunlight spilling through the blinds and casting familiar patterns across the floor. The house had changed. The tension that had gripped it for weeks had not disappeared, but it had transformed into a controlled, deliberate rhythm. Every room, every object, every subtle sound carried meaning now. I moved through the house with careful precision, checking cameras, reviewing logs, and ensuring that the boundaries I had set were fully respected. The confrontation, accountability, and subtle reconciliation had shifted the balance of power permanently. I began the day by reinforcing security measures. Sensitive items, including the vial and related materials, were double-locked in secure compartments. Cameras were reviewed, angles adjusted, and logs updated. Each precaution served not only to protect, but to assert control. I wasn't acting out of paranoia. I was asserting authority. The house had been reclaimed, and I was determined to maintain oversight over every potential vulnerability. My vigilance was now systematic, disciplined, and thorough. She emerged into the kitchen mid-morning, moving cautiously, aware of my observation. Every step was measured, every gesture deliberate. She had clearly internalized the boundaries and the consequences of overstepping them. I observed quietly, noting the subtle tension in her shoulders, the careful way she handled objects, the precise timing of her movements. This was acknowledgement without challenge, proof that the balance had shifted decisively. I addressed the day's priorities directly. "This house runs on clarity and responsibility," I said, calm but firm, my voice carrying authority. "Any action that undermines trust or safety will be addressed immediately. There is no ambiguity." She nodded subtly, her expression controlled but measured, signaling understanding without submission. The psychological weight of accountability was firmly in place, and she could no longer maneuver without consequence. Throughout the day, I implemented additional routines designed to reinforce structure and safety. Children's meals were double-checked, routines tightened, and access points monitored. I reviewed schedules, deliveries, and household activities, ensuring that nothing could be tampered with or misused. The subtle patterns of control, observation, and accountability became the foundation for stability. I moved with deliberate calm, observing every micro-expression, every small movement, every reaction. This was strategy, vigilance, and authority in practice. By afternoon, I began reinforcing the psychological dimension of control. I maintained eye contact during conversations, letting silence carry weight, allowing subtle gestures to communicate expectation and authority. I noticed her recalibrations, the small adjustments in posture, the deliberate pacing of steps, the careful modulation of speech. She understood now that the household's equilibrium was not negotiable and that boundaries were absolute. Her behavior reflected recognition, acknowledgement, and the quiet acceptance of oversight. I also focused on consolidating a sense of normalcy for the children. They were unaware of the delicate power dynamics and manipulations that had occurred, and it was essential to maintain their security and stability. Meals, routines, and interactions were conducted with care, observation, and attention to detail. The household operated smoothly on the surface, but beneath that surface, control, awareness, and accountability were firmly established. Evening brought a final layer of consolidation. I reviewed camera footage, cross-referenced logs, and verified that all protective measures were intact. I observed her one last time, noting the subtle signs of acceptance. Her measured movements, her attention to detail, her adherence to the boundaries I had established. The house had shifted into a controlled rhythm. Vigilance, observation, and subtle authority maintained equilibrium. Every whisper, every movement, every potential threat was accounted for. Before sleep, I walked through the home one last time, checking locks, confirming surveillance, and reinforcing mental clarity. The whisper that had once haunted me, the poison has started working, now served as a benchmark, a reminder of the vigilance, strategy, and precision that had restored balance. It was no longer a threat, but a symbol of control and preparedness. I had moved from vulnerability to mastery, from fear to calculated authority. Lying in bed that night, I reflected on the transformation. Weeks of tension, observation, confrontation, and strategic action had reshaped not only the household but myself. I had reclaimed control, established accountability, and created an environment in which vigilance, preparation, and deliberate authority ensured stability. The equilibrium was delicate, but it was firmly mine. Tomorrow, the house would continue to function, subtly reinforcing order, boundaries, and psychological dominance. I was awake, aware, and fully in command, an unassailable presence in a space that had once been threatened by deception and betrayal. Morning arrived with a crisp clarity, the sunlight stretching across the living room floor like a silent witness to the weeks of tension that had passed. I moved deliberately through the house, checking cameras, reviewing logs, and ensuring that the measures I had put in place were still intact. The boundaries, the precautions, the subtle authority I had established, all of it had become routine. Control had shifted, accountability had been enforced, and the household had settled into a rhythm I now fully commanded. She emerged from the bedroom, her movements measured, cautious, almost deferential, not out of submission, but out of awareness. There was no tension, no attempt at deception, only acknowledgement. The subtle recalibration of her behavior was proof that the lessons of the past weeks had been absorbed. Every step she took, every gesture she made, was aligned with the reality I had imposed. Clear boundaries, accountability, and vigilance. She had recognized that any attempt to subvert the household now carried consequences she could no longer ignore. I greeted her calmly, my voice steady, carrying both authority and clarity. The house, the family, and this life operate on respect and responsibility, I said. What happened before will not happen again. Every action has consequences, and we are accountable for them. Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, there was no trace of the mask she had once worn. The acknowledgement was subtle, but it carried weight. She understood fully that the balance of power had shifted permanently. The children moved through the house, blissfully unaware of the psychological and strategic battles that had unfolded. I watched them, noting their routines, their interactions, and their safety. Protecting them had been paramount, and now I could see that my vigilance had not only preserved their security, but restored a sense of normalcy. Every precaution I had implemented, from monitoring meals to controlling access points, ensured their environment was stable, predictable, and safe. The household's equilibrium was no longer fragile. It was deliberate, structured, and enduring. By mid-morning, I began reinforcing the psychological dimension of control. I maintained calm, deliberate eye contact during conversations, letting silence amplify the weight of presence and authority. Every subtle gesture, every deliberate movement, communicated that the household operated under vigilance and careful oversight. She moved within this framework. Her own actions aligned with the boundaries I had established. There was no defiance, no subtle manipulation, only recognition of the new order. I also began a careful, deliberate conversation about reconciliation. We cannot undo the past, I said, measured, calm, but we can establish trust moving forward. Boundaries, accountability, and transparency are non-negotiable. We follow them, and the household remains safe. We fail, and the consequences are unavoidable. She listened quietly, nodding subtly, acknowledging the truth without argument or deflection. For the first time, there was no ambiguity about her acceptance of responsibility. Afternoon passed with deliberate observation and quiet reinforcement. I monitored movements, verified safety measures, and ensured that the rhythm of the household reflected stability. The cameras were still in place, but they had become symbols rather than instruments of fear, symbols of accountability and vigilance that reinforced order without active threat. Every aspect of the house, from locked compartments to structured routines, reflected a balance that had been earned through careful action and calculated observation. As evening approached, I walked through the home one last time, checking every lock, verifying every precaution, and ensuring the equilibrium remained intact. The whisper that had haunted me at the start, "The poison has started working," no longer carried fear. It was a reminder of the path I had traversed, from vulnerability to mastery, from deception to awareness, from fear to deliberate authority. I had faced betrayal, reclaimed control, and established conditions under which the household would function securely. Night fell, and the house finally seemed at peace, quiet but structured, tense but stable. I lay in bed reflecting on the transformation. The weeks of deception, fear, confrontation, and strategic vigilance had reshaped not only the household but myself. I had evolved from a man testing care to a man fully aware, fully prepared, and fully in command. Trust could be rebuilt under boundaries and accountability, and the equilibrium we now maintained was firm, deliberate, and enduring. For the first time in weeks, I felt a profound sense of closure. The threat had been neutralized, the predator exposed, and the balance of power permanently restored. I was awake, alert, and in command, not merely surviving, but thriving within the household I had reclaimed. The whispers of danger had become echoes of clarity, the shadows of deception had been dispelled, and the house finally reflected the stability, safety, and authority I had fought to establish. As sleep finally came, it was deep, measured, and deserved. I had tested care, faced betrayal, enforced accountability, and restored equilibrium. The house, the family, and my life were secure. I was no longer vulnerable. I was in command. And for the first time in weeks, I could rest knowing that the equilibrium was not temporary. It was mine, fully earned and enduring.